just a moment, we will be joined by Professor Ilya Somin of George Mason University's Scalia School of Law to talk about his book, Free to Move, and what we're seeing right now in terms of the pandemic and restrictions on immigration in the United States. But first, justice friends, superheroes have to look their best. Do you remember a superhero who wasn't well-groomed? I do. It was Chubby Thor. Odin's son was not representing, and nobody was scruffy man enough to point it out. Don't do that to your superhero dad. With great grooming comes great responsibility. After Dad leaves his fortress of solitude, the bathroom, he wants to come out of his dad cave having transformed from Shaggy Man into Scruffy Man. Scruffyman.com is your source for dad's grooming power. Groomers Assemble, the beard grooming kit for men. It's got everything you need for daily grooming. The state-of-the-art MK2 razor is made from the same aluminum as the UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter. You'll think Stark himself designed it for your Iron Man. Make sure your superhero dad is Scruffy Man. He'll look his best faster than a speeding razor, able to cut through jungles of hair in a single swipe. So log on to scruffyman.com today. You'll get free shipping on all orders over $49, and your gift will arrive quick as a flash. Use the promo code Jimmy and Shazam. You'll get an additional 20% off Father's Day discounts. That's scruffyman.com and use the promo code Jimmy at checkout. Appreciate our friends and sponsor at scruffyman.com. So right now we are amidst a pandemic, and this pandemic has changed a heck of a lot of things about how we live. It's also impacted immigration to the United States and what restrictions have been put in place at the federal level on people able to come into our country. Is this legal? What has been done? And how does it fit in with the idea that you are free to move? That is, that it's not just ballot box voting, but also moving with your feet that matters. I'm pleased to be joined by the author of this book, Free to Move, Foot Voting, Migration, and Political Freedom. Professor Ilya Somin of George Mason University's Scalia School of Law joins me now. Ilya, welcome to the show. It's good to have you today.
Thank you very much for having me.
I appreciate the time today, especially because this is such an interesting topic. And so I want to start with the one that's especially relevant today as far as the pandemic, and then broaden out into more of what your book talks about and so forth. So let's start there, which is what has been done at this point up till now to address the pandemic. At least that's the argument, of course, for restrictions on immigration. What policy steps have been taken, and what's your overall sense for the appropriateness and legality of that? So broad question to start.
The policy step that has been taken is to make the U.S. more closed to immigration than it ever has been in the entire over 200-year history of the country. Under the policy that President Trump adopted in April, they have virtually closed down all entry of people or migrants seeking to enter for the purpose of getting permanent residency or citizenship. They have also stopped virtually all processing of refugees. That in both cases is completely unprecedented. They have not blocked all processing of temporary work visas. That's a separate topic, but they have blocked, in effect, virtually all entry by people who would want to try to stay permanently. Is it legal? I think it is not, but I do concede that it is probably permissible, though not certainly so under the Supreme Court's decision in Trump versus Hawaii, the travel ban case, where they interpreted this 1950s federal law that allows the president to bar entry by any foreigners that he claims are detrimental to the interest of the United States. The Supreme Court interpreted that as giving the president a virtually blank check to bar anyone he wants. And if that's correct, then he could probably do this. So there are some issues that arise with the current set of policies that weren't addressed in that case. But I think that case was wrongly decided, and the fact that you can use it to have a near total ban on immigration by executive fiat is actually a good example of how that decision was made wrongly, in that it essentially enables the president to make a massive power grab and to wield what is basically legislative power, not just executive power.
And that expansion of executive power is something Congress has repeatedly authorized in a lot of different areas, though. So it's important to keep that in mind. In terms of the case, though, with Trump versus Hawaii, I mean, it doesn't come down more than anything to the circumstances of why, if we have a certain crisis situation, he's concerned about national security implications. In this case, he's concerned about the spread of the virus, that at least from the viewpoint of the court, it provides some sort of a justification or a reasonable pretext to take such a drastic step?
If the court had said that the government must have proof that there really is some strong evidence that this step is necessary, that would be more limited than what they actually did, whereas they basically said that almost the mere assertion that there is some kind of interest, even with little or no proof, that that's going to be sufficient. I would add that both in the travel ban case and in this case, the evidence that this is actually necessary is extremely weak at best. In the travel ban case, for the countries from which people were barred, in the previous 40 years, there had been not a single case of any American killed in any act of terrorism on U.S. soil by migrants from those countries. In this case, completely barring all migration, or virtually all, even from countries where the pandemic is actually much less prevalent than it is in the U.S., that does little or nothing to actually prevent its spread. If anything, it actually makes things worse in two ways. One is it diverts a lot of resources towards immigration enforcement that could otherwise be used to fight the pandemic. And it ensures that for a lot of people, the only way to get in is illegally. And if they get in illegally, that actually makes it more likely that they won't report for testing to public health authorities. Sure. They won't cooperate with health measures and the like. So far from making things better, this is actually making things worse.
Well, what do you make, though, of the original ban specifically from China when President Trump put that into place? Because even Dr. Fauci and other experts have said that they believe that helped, at least on a nominal basis, in terms of the spread of the virus early on. What about a targeted ban like that on travel from a country like China, or maybe earlier on from Italy, for example, specifically because those were very significant hotspots?
A targeted ban might be more defensible, though as it turned out, it looks like it did very little to actually stop the spread of the virus, because we have community spread on a large scale in the US anyway. So at best, what it accomplished maybe, and even this is questionable, what it accomplished is maybe delayed the spread by a few weeks. But since the Trump administration utterly failed to use those weeks to make us better prepared on the testing front, indeed, far from making us better prepared, they actually impeded private sector efforts to develop better testing. I would say that the China travel ban and later the Europe one actually achieved very little, if anything. If anything, the way it was done, it might actually have spread the virus faster because it was announced in such a pell-mell rush. A lot of people rushed back from China who otherwise might not have done so as quickly. And there's now some evidence, not conclusive evidence, but some that actually helped spread the virus more quickly than might have happened otherwise.
Obviously, I don't want to delve into a debate on some of those aspects, but it's interesting from the pandemic ban standpoint to get your perspective on that. I tend to think that it at least helped to slow the spread. I want to ask you, though, because in your piece that you had published for Reason and the Volokh Conspiracy about this exact topic, there was a response from Jason Richwine of National Review responding as follows, and I want to get your reply to this. Libertarians who take Somin's position that almost everyone should be allowed to enter, but not terrorists or disease carriers, need to answer a follow-up question. How do they intend to enforce the restrictions? Surely not with a border wall, which is anathema to immigration boosters. How about expanding the Border Patrol, ICE raids, a nationwide ban on sanctuary jurisdictions? To my knowledge, they oppose all of those tools for immigration enforcement. So what would you do, and this will bring us into the broader discussion, whether you're seeing, as we saw on the screen there, illegal immigration or different things happening in that regard, when you have protests that are happening, when you have different people coming in from countries and so forth, what do you think could be done in order to potentially restrict the flow of immigrants that could be either hostile to the United States potentially or spread some sort of a viral infection?
I responded to Rich Wine in an update to my post, and I'm happy to summarize what I said here. And that is that when you talk about pandemics and terrorists, those risks could arise from people within the country as well as people outside it. And we don't need a general capacity to stop all movement within the country to deal with that. Rather, we need a targeted investigatory capacity to target particular individuals who might be a danger. And the same thing applies with foreigners who might be risks in that regard. If anything, by dropping our efforts to keep out lots of people who all they want to do is work and have greater freedom and opportunity in their home country, we would have lots of resources left over to deal with actual terrorists, disease risks, and so on. For example, in my book that you mentioned, Free to Move, I estimate that if we were to abolish the ICE and redeploy the resources to conventional law enforcement and terrorism prevention, we could hire many thousands of additional police officers, we could track terrorists better, and so forth. So far from aiding the war against terrorism or efforts to stop the spread of disease, the current immigration enforcement system is actually making it worse. I would add that it also makes it worse by creating necessarily a substantial population of people who are here illegally and then have a strong incentive not to cooperate with public health authorities. Also, our immigration detention centers that we have are themselves disease-spreading risks, and serious problems have begun to arise there.
Professor Ilya Somin of George Mason University's Scalia School of Law joining us, author of the book Free to Move, Foot Voting, Migration, and Political Freedom. And we'll get to, I think, probably back to immigration a little bit in a moment, but let's talk about the fundamental premise of Free to Move, because you argue, Ilya, that when it comes to the ballot box, that's one way to vote, but voting with your feet may in fact be even more significant. Talk to me a little bit about that and what you mean by voting with your feet and how that compares to going to the ballot box and casting a ballot.
Sure. We can vote with our feet in three different kind of ways. The most obvious one is that in a federal system like we have in the US, you can choose what state or local government you want to live under based on what public policies you like, their public services, their taxes, their regulations, and so on. You can also do so through international migration. You can choose what country you want to live in if they let you, based on what policies you prefer. That's actually how most of the ancestors of the population of the United States got here. They preferred the US and its policies over those of Europe or various Asian countries. And third, you can often vote with your feet in the private sector by choosing what private planned communities you might want to live in, what civil society organizations you want to join, private schools, and so on. And that has two big advantages over conventional ballot box voting. One is that when you vote at the ballot box, the chance that your vote will make a difference to the outcome of an election is extremely small, about 1 in 60 million in a presidential election. So it's hard to say you have meaningful political freedom if the chance that your choice will actually make a difference is so incredibly small. When you vote with your feet, on the other hand, again, if you're allowed to do so, the chance that your decision will make a real difference to the kind of policies you live under is much higher. And precisely for that reason, you have a much better incentive to be informed and to acquire relevant information about the issues involved when people vote at the ballot box, because there's so little chance their vote will make a difference. Most of them don't make much effort to learn about the issues, and survey data overwhelmingly shows that often they don't know even very basic things about how the political system works or what government policies are like. Certainly, it even shows that only about a third of Americans can even name the three branches of the federal government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial.
So this idea of moving about, one of the common criticisms that I hear is there are a lot of people who are economically disadvantaged, and the costs of moving from one city to another, let alone from one state to another, or even more from one country to another, can be astronomical and too difficult. And therefore, it's not something that people on the lower end of the economic spectrum can really count on, this idea of voting with your feet. What do you make of that argument?
Historically, the truth is exactly the opposite of that. The biggest beneficiaries of voting with your feet are, in fact, historically the poor and disadvantaged. As I mentioned before, that is actually how the United States was peopled. Most of the people who came here from Europe, Asia, and elsewhere were not the wealthy and the powerful. It was precisely the poor, disadvantaged, and oppressed. If you look in American history, often it is also the poor and the oppressed who have bettered their lives through voting with their feet. Consider, for example, the Great Migration of African Americans fleeing the Jim Crow era South. Today, we do have some unfortunate obstacles that have been created that make it more difficult for the poor and disadvantaged to move around. Immigration restrictions internationally, but also domestically, such things as exclusionary zoning, but those can be reduced. In addition, if you decentralize power to lower levels of government, localities perhaps, and not just states, and even more so to the private sector, often you can create opportunities for people to vote with their feet without actually having to physically move very far at all. Moving to a neighboring town or choosing a different private sector organization to work with, that can be done with much lower moving costs than, say, moving to another state, and certainly lower cost than moving to another country.
In talking with you and reading some of your book here, Free to Move, Professor Ilya Somin, one thing that kind of comes to my mind is the idea of voting with your dollar, which is the notion that when you're talking in economic context, you buy products from companies that you support in addition to ones that will provide you with a service and a product. So if you're going to be buying from a company for a shirt and you want to make a determination, hey, I don't really want to go to this manufacturer because they're making that shirt in sweatshops in China or something like that, you can make that decision and spend your money on a different company instead of that one because you don't like how they're going about their business practices and treating other people or what have you. It seems like it's a similar thing here where it's not just saying, hey, let's have the government make restrictions or do certain things because of the ballot box voting, but it's also individuals should be able to move to places or spend money in places, in the case of voting with your dollar, that fit more with what they're looking for, with things that fit with their values and so forth. That's what comes to mind.
So I'm not against that, and I think sometimes it can make people happier if they get to do that. But it's not as effective as voting simply for the purpose of getting yourself a different situation.
It just seems similar
unless you're buying a really large number of shirts, it's very unlikely that your individual purchasing decision will make a big difference as to the company's labor practices or other policies. So in that respect, it's a little bit like traditional ballot box voting. Whereas on the other hand, if I like shirt company A's shirts better than shirt company B's, I can get the shirts that I like for myself, so long as obviously I'm allowed to switch my purchasing decision.
I think that's an interesting point in terms of basically what you're getting at is what is the way to maximize the power and influence of the individual in a governmental context, and more than being one voter out of potentially millions in a municipality or in a state, you instead become one person who actually takes away tax revenue or different things that can impact the community that you leave, and maybe get the politicians there to reassess and reevaluate what should we do differently in order to keep people from leaving, like, I don't know, leaving New York State and coming to a place like Colorado because they find it too expensive there. Just as an example.
Yeah, so it's certainly true that foot voting can put pressure on jurisdictions that lose people and therefore lose tax revenue. And I think there are historical examples of that. As I explained in the book, though, even if the jurisdictions do nothing, that is, even if they just simply pay no attention to how many people are coming or going, foot voting can still expand people's choices and their freedom, because at least those people who do move to places they like better, they'll be better off and they'll have freedom of choice, even if it doesn't change the behavior of the governments. Though if it does change it, that can make the system work even better.
Yeah, no, it's important to keep in mind that not all of these effects will happen, or not all effects happen to any decision that an individual makes. I mean, you're going to have certain interpretations that may come from the politicians you leave behind, and other impacts and things that may come down the line. Again, we're talking with Professor Ilya Somin at George Mason University's Scalia School of Law, author of the book Free to Move. Professor, when you talk about the idea of foot voting from an immigration context, play that one out for us, especially given that right now we have a lot of concerns about Americans who feel that genuinely Jobs are being taken by illegal immigrants who come into this country, or even to some legal immigrants who come into this country with permission through H-1B visa programs, just as one example, but others similar to that. What do you make of the idea, first, of voting with your feet in immigration context, and then second, the economic criticism that we often hear from folks these days, especially from President Trump, but many others, about immigration and what it can mean for average American workers?
So immigration is definitely a mechanism of voting with your feet. I think that's pretty obvious. In fact, that's the entire history of the United States, is immigration building up this country because of voting with your feet. On the jobs argument, I think that argument relies on a fallacy that economists have long pointed out, called the lump of labor fallacy. This is the idea that there's a fixed number of jobs, so that if person A gets a job, that necessarily means that B, C, or D can't have one. In reality, the number of jobs is not fixed. It depends on the productivity of the economy, innovation, and various other factors. And when immigrants come in and have the opportunity to be productive, that increases the overall wealth of the economy, which in turn increases not just the number of jobs, but also increases both the quality and quantity of products that people can buy, and also increases innovation. Lots of data show that on average, immigrants actually are more innovative than natives. They're more likely to establish businesses, make discoveries, and so forth. There are various reasons for that, but the data is pretty strong in it. In terms of labor competition, I don't deny, obviously, that there are some cases where immigrants compete with other people, including natives, for jobs, but the data overwhelmingly show that actually new immigrants, the main competition that they pose is to other relatively recent immigrants, because those people often are, at least in the short run, are in the same sector of the economy. So when you look at studies of this by economists over a period of many years, immigrants tend to increase incomes for the vast majority of native-born, but they might have a negative impact on some subcategories, particularly high school dropouts. Where that is the case, there are much easier and less draconian solutions than keeping people out. For example, you can simply increase the earned income tax credit, and you can do that by tapping some of the enormous wealth that is created by immigration. I would add, some people think, well, things must be different when there is a recession or possibly even a depression going on, but historical studies suggest otherwise. During the Great Depression, for example, we deported several 100,000 Mexican Americans, including even some that were U.S. citizens. Studies of that show that that actually had no increase in terms of native-born wages in the areas where these people were deported from, in part for the kinds of reasons that I mentioned earlier, that often they're not in the same job market as natives, and also any beneficial effects on natives were more than offset by harmful effects like increasing prices, decreasing productivity and innovation, and so on.
Very interesting. We're out of time, but I will definitely have you back for further discussion on the immigration issue. But be sure to check out Professor Ilya Somin's book, Free to Move, Foot Voting, Migration, and Political Freedom. So great to have you today. Best of luck with the book, and thanks for taking the time on this Wednesday to join us at the Crossroads.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Professor. Again, Professor of Law at the Scalia Law School at George Mason University. Ilya Somin joining us. Check out his book, Free to Move. And yes, by the way, George Mason University is the home as well in the economics department of the John M. Olin Distinguished Professor of Economics, Dr. Walter E. Williams, who was on the show just a couple of weeks ago. Thanks for watching this clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. You do not want to miss a minute of engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe today to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel, and you'll be sure to catch our live broadcast. I appreciate your support.
I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.